In shadows older than empires, where power and faith have danced for 2 millennia, lies an institution that mastered survival through secrecy. From catacombs, where early Christians hid sacred texts from Roman flames, to marble corridors where modern popes wrestle with financial scandals, the Vatican perfected techniques of concealment that would make intelligence agencies envious. This is how a persecuted sect transformed into the world's most enduring government, not through armies, but through information itself. Behind gilded doors rest documents that toppled kingdoms, prophecies that predicted world wars, and financial records linking sacred institutions to history's darkest chapters. The church that once carried scrolls in leather satchels now guards 50 miles of archives containing secrets that shaped crusades and sparked reformations. What makes this urgently contemporary is how these medieval methods collide with an age demanding transparency, forcing ancient secrets into unforgiving light. Beneath the cobblestone streets of Rome, where the thunder of chariot wheels drowns out whispered prayers, St. Lawrence clutches a leather satchel against his chest as torchlight flickers off tunnel walls carved from volcanic rock. The deacon's hands shake, not from fear, but from the weight of what he carries. Scrolls containing the words of apostles, letters from communities scattered across the empire, testimonies of martyrs whose blood still stains the arena sand above his head. Behind him, the sound of hobnailed boots echoes through passages that wind like arteries beneath the eternal city. Diocletian's soldiers move with the methodical precision of hunters who know their prey has nowhere left to run. The emperor's edict burns fresh in Lawrence's memory. Surrender the treasures of the church, or face the gridiron that waits like a hungry beast in the imperial dungeons. Water drips from limestone ceiling onto manuscripts that preserve the teachings of men who walked with Christ himself. Each drop threatens to blur ink that cost scribes their sight. Words copied by candlelight in hidden chambers, where discovery meant crucifixion. Lawrence presses deeper into darkness that offers the only sanctuary left to those who refuse to sacrifice to gods of marble and bronze. These tunnels stretch for miles beneath the city, their chambers carved by believers who understood that truth requires protection from those who would destroy it. Stone niches hold more than bodies. They conceal libraries that preserve wisdom emperors cannot burn, testimonies that will outlive the bronze statues of forgotten Caesars. The very rock becomes a vault, its silence more secure than any fortress walls. Footsteps grow closer as pursuit tightens like a noose around the necks of the faithful. Lawrence reaches a junction where 3 passages meet, their darkness offering choices that could mean salvation or doom. Behind him lies capture and the slow death that awaits those who defy imperial will. Ahead stretches uncertainty that might preserve the sacred knowledge his community has died to protect. 300 miles to the east, in Alexandria's great library, where papyrus scrolls tower like grain in Pharaoh's storehouses, Eusebius of Caesarea labors over his ecclesiastical history, while civil war tears the empire apart. His quill scratches across parchment as he records testimonies that would otherwise vanish with their witnesses, accounts of how believers preserved their scriptures when soldiers came hunting for Christian books, stories of communities that hid their sacred texts in places no Roman would think to search. The bishop's sources speak with voices that still tremble from memory. A woman in Antioch tells of burying the Gospel of Matthew beneath her kitchen floor, covering it with tiles that bore pagan symbols to deflect suspicion. A merchant from Ephesus describes how his community dispersed their library among trusted households, each family guarding fragments that meant nothing alone, but formed a complete collection when reunited. These strategies of concealment become templates that will guide the church through centuries of persecution yet to come. Night after night, Eusebius documents the price of faith under emperors, who view Christianity as a disease that threatens Rome's foundations. His chronicles preserve names of those who chose death over denial: Polycarp, who smiled as flames consumed his flesh; Perpetua, who entered arena singing hymns; countless others whose courage created a literature of martyrdom that inspires and instructs future generations facing similar trials. The historian's work reveals patterns that will shape how the Church handles dangerous knowledge for millennia. When authorities demand surrender of sacred books, communities produce heretical texts or pagan scrolls instead, claiming these represent their entire collection. When officials search for hidden scriptures, believers lead them to empty chambers, while the real treasures rest beneath false floors or inside hollowed statues that appear to honor Roman gods. Eusebius records a conversation with Mensurius, Bishop of Carthage, whose creativity in protecting manuscripts becomes legendary throughout North Africa. "We gave them books," the bishop confesses with a smile that never reaches his eyes, "but not the books they sought. Heretical writings and Gnostic nonsense served their purpose, while our true treasures remained safe." This policy of strategic deception establishes precedents that will guide ecclesiastical responses to government intrusion throughout history. Even as Eusebius documents the final spasms of imperial persecution, winds of change blow across the Mediterranean world. February gusts howl across the Milvian Bridge as Constantine stares at military standards that bear the Shiro symbol for the first time in Roman history. The emperor's decision to embrace Christianity stems from calculations as complex as any battle plan: political necessity wrapped in spiritual conviction, pragmatic alliance disguised as divine revelation. His conversion will transform not only the empire, but the very nature of how the Church guards its secrets. The Edict of Milan, proclaimed in 313 AD, reverses 3 centuries of persecution, with words that echo like thunder across territories stretching from Britain's mists to Egypt's deserts. "We grant to Christians and to all others the freedom to follow whatever form of worship they choose," Constantine declares, but his motives run deeper than tolerance. The emperor recognizes that Christians have mastered the art of organization under pressure, developed communication networks that span continents, and proven their ability to preserve knowledge that others would destroy. It's a breathtaking turn. Churches move from secrecy to prominence, now anchoring the centers of civic life. Bishops who once fled from Roman magistrates now advise the emperor on matters of state. Most significantly, the clandestine methods developed during persecution become the foundation for a new kind of power, one that operates through influence rather than force, through access to information rather than control of armies. Constantine's delayed baptism reveals his calculating approach to this spiritual revolution. The emperor waits until his deathbed to receive the sacrament, hedging his bets between old gods and new until the final moment when political calculations no longer matter. His deferred conversion becomes a template for rulers who recognize Christianity's value without fully embracing its demands, creating relationships between throne and altar that mix genuine faith with cold pragmatism. The Council of Nicaea, convened in 325 AD, demonstrates how Constantine intends to harness spiritual authority for imperial purposes. Bishops from across the empire gather in the emperor's summer palace to debate the nature of Christ, but their discussions carry implications that reach far beyond theology. Each doctrinal decision determines which texts will be preserved as sacred and which will be condemned as heretical, which communities will enjoy imperial favor and which will face persecution. Behind closed doors, where morning light filters through windows that overlook gardens tended by imperial slaves, 300 bishops wrestle with questions that will shape Christianity for millennia. Arius of Alexandria argues that Christ represents a created being, subordinate to the Father, a position that threatens to fragment the divine unity on which universal authority depends. Athanasius counters with passionate defenses of Christ's full divinity, recognizing that anything less undermines the theological foundations of ecclesiastical power. The debates reveal how doctrinal precision serves political control. When bishops declare Christ of one substance with the Father, they establish theological language that only trained scholars can interpret correctly. This technical vocabulary creates barriers between educated clergy and ordinary believers, ensuring that access to divine truth requires institutional mediation. The complex formulations that emerge from conciliar deliberations become tools for distinguishing orthodox insiders from heretical outsiders. The way the council handled challenging texts comes through clearly in what's been written down. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, with its claims about female apostolic authority, disappears from approved reading lists. The Gospel of Thomas, whose mystical teachings suggest direct access to divine wisdom without ecclesiastical guidance, vanishes into private collections where only initiates can study its dangerous implications. These suppressed works don't perish. They migrate to hidden libraries where their preservation becomes an act of resistance. The Nicene decisions create categories that will govern information control for centuries. Orthodox writings receive official copying and distribution through networks that reach every corner of the empire. Heretical texts face prohibition and destruction, though copies survive in places where imperial authority cannot penetrate. Deuterocanonical books occupy a grey zone between acceptance and rejection, their status debated by scholars who understand that theological classifications carry profound political implications. Constantine's establishment of Constantinople provides a new stage for the drama of spiritual politics. The emperor's city rises where Europe meets Asia, its placement strategic for controlling trade routes that connect 3 continents. Here, in palaces that rival Rome's grandeur, a new form of Christian empire takes shape, one that combines imperial administration with ecclesiastical hierarchy in ways that blur all traditional boundaries between secular and sacred authority. The imperial library that Constantine orders, constructed in his new capital, becomes a laboratory for controlling dangerous knowledge. Scribes work under strict supervision to produce authorized versions of biblical texts, their copies checked against approved exemplars to ensure doctrinal conformity. Variant readings that suggest alternative interpretations disappear from official manuscripts, though they survive in private collections maintained by scholars who value textual accuracy over theological convenience. Eusebius himself becomes Constantine's biographer, crafting an official narrative that portrays the emperor's conversion as divinely ordained triumph over pagan darkness. The bishop's life of Constantine establishes templates for court historiography that will influence how Christian rulers present themselves for centuries. Yet Eusebius's private correspondence reveals awareness that Constantine's spirituality remains subordinate to his political calculations, creating tensions between public piety and personal conviction that characterize Christian monarchy throughout its history. In 391 AD, the Serapeum of Alexandria falls as Patriarch Theophilus leads crowds that tear down one of the ancient world's most celebrated centers of learning. The assault represents more than iconoclastic fury. It demonstrates how Christian authorities eliminate competing sources of wisdom that might challenge their exclusive claims to truth. Scrolls that preserved the works of Aristotle and Plato burn alongside texts that recorded Egyptian religious traditions, their destruction justified as necessary for protecting pure doctrine from pagan contamination. Even so, destruction proves incomplete. Scholars loyal to classical learning spirit manuscripts to safety in monasteries and private collections where they await more tolerant times. The works of Origen, condemned as heretical by later councils, survive in Syriac translations preserved by communities beyond imperial reach. Gnostic texts, dismissed as dangerous nonsense, find refuge in desert caves where their burial protects them from destruction while preserving them for rediscovery by future generations. The Council of Carthage in 397 AD completes the process of canonical definition begun at Nicaea. 27 books receive recognition as authentic Christian scripture, while dozens of others face rejection as spurious or dangerous. The decisions reflect not merely theological criteria, but practical considerations about which texts support ecclesiastical authority and which texts challenge institutional control. The Gospel of Philip, with its emphasis on mystical knowledge available to all believers, disappears from approved reading. The Acts of Paul and Thecla, featuring a female teacher who baptizes converts, vanishes into private collections. Around 495 AD, the Decretum Gelasianum offers the first organized list of books the Church declared off-limits. Pope Gelasius I lists works by title and author, creating an index that guides future censorship efforts. The decree reveals the scope of early Christian literature that official channels suppressed: Gospels attributed to apostles, Acts describing miraculous deeds, Apocalypses promising divine revelations. Each prohibited title represents a path not taken, an alternative vision of Christian truth that survived long enough to require official condemnation. Underground preservation networks emerge as communities committed to textual diversity resist homogenization efforts. Monasteries in Ireland copy Greek manuscripts that disappear from continental libraries. Coptic Christians in Egypt maintain versions of biblical books that differ significantly from Latin texts approved by Rome. Syriac-speaking churches preserve traditions that challenge assumptions about early Christian uniformity. These scattered communities become arcs that carry alternative forms of Christian knowledge through floods of Orthodox persecution. The foundation laid on Vatican Hill symbolizes this transformation from persecution to power. Constantine's basilica rises where Peter supposedly died for his faith, its massive columns and gilded decorations proclaiming Christianity's triumph over imperial opposition. Yet the building's magnificence comes at a cost. The institutionalization of a movement that once challenged worldly authority now seeks to embody it. The very stones declare that the Church has exchanged its prophetic voice for political influence. Secret chambers beneath the Basilica House relics, whose authenticity remains forever uncertain. Bones claimed to belong to Peter himself rest in containers that few eyes have seen, their verification impossible, but their symbolic power immense. These sacred remains become focal points for pilgrimages that generate revenue, while reinforcing papal claims to apostolic succession. The relic's power depends not on historical accuracy, but on popular belief, creating dynamics that will characterize ecclesiastical authority throughout the medieval period. Imperial record-keeping systems, adapted for ecclesiastical use, create the administrative foundations for future papal government. Trained scribes who once served Roman bureaucracy transfer their skills to church service, bringing organizational methods that enable coordination across vast territories. The filing systems they develop preserve correspondence, legal decisions, and financial records that document how spiritual authority gradually acquires the characteristics of temporal power. Archive techniques pioneered in imperial chanceries find new applications in preserving ecclesiastical documents. Papal registers begin recording decisions that affect communities throughout the Christian world. Their careful organization, enabling reference to precedents that support papal authority. These administrative innovations create institutional memory that transcends individual pontificates, establishing continuity that strengthens claims to divine guidance in earthly governance. As the 5th century dawns, the foundations are complete for the structure that will dominate Western civilization for a millennium. The catacombs where Lawrence hid his treasures give way to basilicas where those same texts receive public veneration. The persecution that forced early Christians to develop secrecy becomes the expertise that enables their successors to control information flow throughout the known world. The transformation from hidden sect to imperial partner creates templates for managing dangerous knowledge that will serve ecclesiastical interests for centuries to come. Seeds planted in catacombs and council chambers await seasons when they will grow into the massive edifice of medieval papacy. The techniques of concealment learned under persecution become tools for maintaining power. The networks developed for survival become mechanisms for control. The next chapter in this epic tale finds these foundations supporting structures that will challenge emperors, crown kings, and reshape the political landscape of Europe through methods that blend spiritual authority with sophisticated information management. What began in darkness prepares to emerge into light, carrying within it all the contradictions and complexities that characterize institutions born in one age, but destined to flourish in another. The church that emerges from these foundations possesses both the prophet's passion for truth and the politician's skill in managing inconvenient realities, a combination that will enable remarkable achievements while creating scandals that echo through eternity. Candlelight flickers across parchment as Cardinal Ottaviani feeds another manuscript to the flames, dancing in the marble hearth of his private chambers. The head of the Holy Office watches with satisfaction as words that once challenged orthodoxy crumble into ash, their dangerous ideas reduced to smoke that curls toward vaulted ceilings, adorned with scenes of divine judgment. Outside his windows, the bells of Rome toll midnight, marking another day in the eternal struggle between truth and heresy, between the Church's divine mission and the human weakness that perpetually threatens it. The book burning before him bears the title, The Secret Gospel of Mark, its pages filled with passages that suggest a more intimate relationship between Christ and his disciples than official doctrine permits. Ottaviani has spent hours studying these forbidden words, memorizing their content before consigning them to destruction. Knowledge, he understands, must be controlled as carefully as any weapon, its power channeled through proper authorities, or eliminated entirely when it threatens the foundations of faith. This scene, repeated countless times across the centuries, represents the culmination of processes that began when persecution ended and the Church assumed responsibility for defining Christian truth. The transformation from hidden sect to imperial ally brought new challenges that required sophisticated solutions. No longer could believers simply preserve their texts from hostile authorities. Now they must determine which writings deserved preservation and which posed dangers too great to tolerate. Forged in some quiet scriptorium during the 8th century, the donation of Constantine shows how written words could be turned into a powerful tool for claiming authority. This magnificent forgery claims that the first Christian sovereign transferred temporal authority over the Western Empire to Pope Sylvester I, creating legal foundations for papal claims that extend far beyond spiritual matters. The document's careful Latin prose and authentic seeming details convinced generations of scholars, kings, and clergy that the Bishop of Rome possesses divine mandate to rule earthly realms as well as heavenly ones. Monks laboring in scriptoriums across Europe copy the donation with the same reverence they reserve for biblical texts, their careful calligraphy transforming political fiction into historical fact. Each manuscript that emerges from these workshops strengthens the legal framework supporting papal ambitions, creating evidence that accumulates like sediment forming rock. The forgery's success depends not on its authenticity, but on its utility, its ability to provide documentation for claims that serve ecclesiastical interests. Lorenzo Valla's devastating critique of the donation in 1440 exposes the document's linguistic anachronisms and historical impossibilities, yet his scholarly demolition barely dents its political influence. Popes continue citing the donation long after humanist scholarship proves its fraudulent nature, demonstrating how useful falsehoods resist correction when they serve powerful interests. The document's exposure reveals the sophisticated methods by which medieval authorities manufactured evidence to support their claims, creating precedents for information manipulation that echo through later centuries. Pope Gregory VII embodies the new breed of pontiff who transforms the Church from spiritual community into governmental institution. His Dictatus Papae, composed around 1075, declares 27 propositions that revolutionize the relationship between religious and secular authority. The Roman pontiff alone can with right be called universal, the document proclaims, establishing claims that extend papal jurisdiction over emperors, kings, and every Christian soul from Ireland to Jerusalem. Gregory's correspondence, preserved in papal registers that document his relentless pursuit of supremacy, reveals the calculating mind behind these revolutionary assertions. His letters to European rulers combine theological arguments with thinly veiled threats, promising divine favor for compliance and spiritual damnation for resistance. The Pope's communications create networks of obligation that bind distant monarchs to Roman will, transforming the Church into a diplomatic force that rivals any earthly kingdom. The investiture controversy that erupts from Gregory's reforms creates the first great constitutional crisis of medieval Europe, when Henry IV of Germany challenges papal authority over episcopal appointments. Their conflict escalates into a struggle that determines whether spiritual or temporal power will dominate Christian society. Gregory's excommunication of the sovereign sends shockwaves through courts from England to Hungary, proving that papal weapons can humble even the mightiest rulers. Henry's submission at Canossa in January 1077 provides the most dramatic demonstration of ecclesiastical triumph over royal pride. The German ruler stands barefoot in snow outside the papal fortress, wearing the rough garments of a penitent, while Gregory deliberates whether to grant absolution. This scene, witnessed by nobles and chroniclers whose accounts spread throughout Europe, establishes visual proof of papal supremacy that propaganda could never achieve through words alone. Secret negotiations that precede Henry's public humiliation reveal the sophisticated diplomatic machinery that supports papal policy. Gregory's agents conduct parallel discussions with German nobles who oppose their sovereign, creating conditions that force royal submission. Documents preserved in hidden archives record promises made and prices paid for noble cooperation, demonstrating how spiritual authority employs temporal methods to achieve its goals. The papal schism that tears the Church apart from 1378 to 1417 exposes the fragility of institutions built on claims to divine authority. When rival popes in Rome and Avignon each claim legitimacy while hurling anathemas at their opponents, the spectacle undermines centuries of carefully constructed supremacy. Cardinals who once spoke with unified voice fragment into competing factions, their secret correspondence revealing the political calculations behind theological positions. Martin V's election at the Council of Constance ends the schism by eliminating rival claimants through methods that blend conciliar authority with strategic violence. The documents that record this resolution remain sealed in archives where their contents cannot undermine the mythology of unbroken apostolic succession. The Church's ability to conceal the messy realities behind its triumphant narratives demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how institutional memory shapes contemporary authority. Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 revolutionizes the relationship between clergy and laity through innovations that seem pastoral but serve governmental purposes. Pope Innocent III's requirement that Christians confess their sins, at least annually, to their parish priests creates surveillance networks that penetrate every household in Christendom. The confessional becomes an intelligence-gathering system that provides church authorities with intimate knowledge of their subjects' private lives, political opinions, and potential disloyalties. While it shields what's said in confession, the rule of secrecy also forms a clever paradox, one that serves the Church remarkably well. Even if individuals can confess their secrets without fear of betrayal, the knowledge clergy acquire shapes their understanding of social dynamics and political tensions. Priests cannot repeat specific confessions, but their accumulated insights guide policy decisions that affect entire communities. This system creates power based on information while maintaining plausible deniability about its sources. Inquisition procedures that emerge from Lateran decisions establish legal frameworks for identifying and eliminating heretical thought. The manual composed by Bernard Gui around 1320 provides detailed instructions for conducting interrogations that extract confessions while maintaining appearances of due process. His techniques for breaking suspect resistance through psychological pressure and physical coercion become templates for judicial torture that spread throughout European legal systems. Dominican and Franciscan friars, who serve as inquisitors, develop specialized expertise in recognizing heretical beliefs that hide beneath orthodox facades. Their training enables them to detect subtle deviations from approved doctrine through careful questioning that reveals suspect loyalties. The confessions they extract provide raw material for understanding how dangerous ideas spread through populations, enabling authorities to craft countermeasures that address heretical recruitment and organization. Records preserved in inquisitorial archives document the systematic destruction of alternative Christian communities throughout medieval Europe. The Cathars of southern France, the Waldensians of the Alps, the Hussites of Bohemia. Each group faces elimination through methods that combine military assault with bureaucratic efficiency. Detailed inventories record property confiscated from condemned heretics, demonstrating how spiritual justice generates material profits for church institutions. The Chinon parchment, hidden for 7 centuries before its discovery in 2001, reveals how Pope Clement V secretly absolved the Knights Templar while publicly condemning them to satisfy political pressures. This extraordinary document exposes the gap between official church positions and private papal decisions, showing how pontiffs balance competing demands from secular rulers who threaten ecclesiastical independence. The parchment's concealment demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how inconvenient truths must be preserved for potential future use, while remaining hidden from contemporary observation. Templar treasure legends that persist long after the order's destruction reflect the reality that enormous wealth simply vanished when arrests began in 1307. Inventories compiled by royal officials who seized Templar properties across Europe reveal significant discrepancies between expected riches and actual discoveries, suggesting that advance warning enabled the evacuation of portable assets to secure locations. These missing treasures become focal points for speculation that continues into modern times, their fate known only to archives that guard their secrets as carefully as any military fortress. The library that begins taking shape in the 13th century represents a new approach to controlling dangerous knowledge through collection rather than destruction. Unlike the indiscriminate burning that characterizes earlier periods, papal librarians developed systematic methods for acquiring, cataloging, and restricting access to texts that challenge orthodox teaching. Their collecting strategies ensure that heretical works survive in controlled environments where scholars can study them without contaminating popular understanding. Nicholas V's establishment of the formal structure in 1475 creates the institutional framework that will govern information control for centuries. The Pope's background as a humanist scholar enables him to understand how intellectual authority depends on superior access to sources, leading him to invest enormous resources in acquiring manuscripts from across the known world. His vision transforms the collection from defensive repository into offensive weapon that demonstrates ecclesiastical cultural superiority. Greek manuscripts fleeing the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople find refuge in chambers where their preservation serves both scholarly and strategic purposes. These texts preserve classical learning that might otherwise perish, but their concentration in ecclesiastical hands ensures that secular authorities cannot challenge church positions through appeals to ancient wisdom. The collection's growth creates dependence among scholars who must seek papal permission to access materials essential for their research. Separation of the secret archives from the library under Paul V in 1612 reflects the sophistication that characterizes mature ecclesiastical information management. The Pope's decision to create distinct institutions for different types of sensitive materials enables more precise control over access while preserving appearances of scholarly openness. Diplomatic correspondence, legal documents, and administrative records that could embarrass the Church find secure storage in archives, whose very existence remains known only to a select few. The Spanish Inquisition's coordination with Roman authorities creates the first international system for tracking and eliminating heretical thought. Tribunals in Seville, Toledo, and Valencia maintain regular correspondence with the Supreme Sacred Congregation in Rome, sharing intelligence about suspect individuals and dangerous ideas that cross political boundaries. Their cooperation enables the Church to suppress heretical movements before they can establish secure bases in territories beyond any single government's control. Auto da fe ceremonies that climax inquisitorial proceedings serve educational purposes that extend far beyond the punishment of individual heretics. These public spectacles demonstrate the consequences of challenging orthodox teaching, while providing opportunities for authorities to explain exactly which beliefs deserve condemnation. The elaborate rituals that accompany these events create lasting memories that deter potential dissidents while reinforcing popular commitment to approved doctrine. Converso communities in Spain and Portugal face systematic investigation designed to determine whether their conversions from Judaism represent genuine changes of faith or calculated deceptions that conceal continuing adherence to forbidden practices. Inquisitors developed sophisticated techniques for detecting crypto-Jewish behavior through observation of dietary customs, calendar observances, and family relationships that might indicate secret religious loyalties. The evidence they compile creates detailed portraits of how religious minorities adapt to persecution through strategic concealment of their true beliefs. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum that emerges from the Council of Trent provides the first systematic catalogue of dangerous books that threaten Catholic teaching. This revolutionary innovation moves beyond ad hoc censorship to create comprehensive frameworks for evaluating published materials before they can influence popular opinion. The index's categories enable authorities to distinguish between works that require total prohibition and those that might be permitted to qualified readers under appropriate supervision. Galileo's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems receives placement on the index, not merely because it advocates heliocentrism, but because it challenges the Church's exclusive authority to interpret natural phenomena. The condemnation establishes precedents for controlling scientific discourse that threaten ecclesiastical claims about the relationship between revealed truth and empirical observation. The physicist's trial demonstrates how theological authorities can suppress inconvenient discoveries by transforming scientific questions into matters of religious obedience. Medieval Jewish-Christian disputations that occur throughout Europe serve as laboratories for testing arguments that support official teaching while identifying weaknesses that require scholarly attention. These public debates between Christian theologians and rabbinical scholars create opportunities for audiences to witness the supposed triumph of true faith over Jewish blindness. Detailed records of these encounters preserve both the arguments deployed and the methods used to ensure favorable outcomes when intellectual exchange might otherwise undermine predetermined conclusions. The papal bull Unam Sanctum, issued by Boniface VIII in 1302, represents the most extreme assertion of ecclesiastical supremacy over temporal authority in medieval history. It is altogether necessary to salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff, the document declares, establishing claims that extend papal jurisdiction over every aspect of human existence. This revolutionary text creates legal foundations for theocratic government that inspire resistance from secular rulers throughout Europe. Philip IV of France's response to Boniface's claims demonstrates how effectively temporal authorities can neutralize ecclesiastical pretensions through strategic application of force. The French king's agents arrest the Pope at Anagni, subjecting him to humiliations that destroy the mystique of papal inviolability. Boniface's death shortly after his release signals the end of medieval papal hopes for universal dominion, though the institutional structures that supported those ambitions survived to serve more modest goals. The Avignon papacy that follows Boniface's humiliation creates new opportunities for French influence over church policy, while generating resistance from other European powers who view papal residence outside Rome as evidence of corruption. The magnificent palace that rises beside the Rhone becomes a symbol of ecclesiastical worldliness that undermines claims to spiritual authority. Yet the administrative innovations developed during this period strengthen bureaucratic capabilities that will serve the Church long after the Pope's return to Rome. Archives that accumulate during the Avignon period preserve correspondence that reveals how extensively political considerations influence ecclesiastical decisions. Letters between popes and French officials document the coordination that shapes church policy toward English and German interests during the 100 Years' War. These materials provide evidence of partisanship that contradicts official claims about papal neutrality in temporal conflicts. Conciliar movement that emerges during the papal schism challenges fundamental assumptions about ecclesiastical authority by asserting that councils possess superior jurisdiction over individual popes. The documents that emerge from Constance and Basel preserve arguments that could justify resistance to papal absolutism, creating intellectual ammunition for future reformers who seek to limit pontifical power. The Church's success in suppressing conciliar theory requires careful management of historical narratives that obscure the movement's theological sophistication. As the medieval period draws toward its close, the foundations are complete for the intellectual and artistic renaissance that will transform European civilization. The archives and libraries that preserve classical learning enable humanist scholars to rediscover ancient wisdom, while the administrative structures developed for controlling information provide models for Renaissance princes who seek to centralize governmental authority. The techniques of persuasion and coercion, perfected during centuries of struggle against heresy, become tools that serve both spiritual and temporal ambitions in the more complex world that approaches. Seeds planted in medieval scriptoriums and inquisitorial chambers await seasons when they will bloom into the magnificent but dangerous flowering of Renaissance culture. The methods of concealment and revelation that serve ecclesiastical interests during this period become the foundations for artistic and intellectual achievements that will astound the world. Yet these same techniques create vulnerabilities that clever enemies will exploit when the Church faces challenges from reformers who understand how to use its own methods against it. Measures once meant to defend orthodoxy grow into powerful tools that end up transforming Europe itself. The next chapter in this epic finds these medieval foundations supporting Renaissance glories that demonstrate ecclesiastical cultural leadership, while creating new forms of scandal that test the Church's ability to maintain its hard-won supremacy over the minds and souls of European Christians. Torchlight dances across the scaffolding that supports Michelangelo Buonarroti as he works alone in the Sistine Chapel, his brush loaded with flesh tones that will transform blank plaster into bodies that writhe with divine inspiration and human suffering. The artist pauses, examining the face he has just painted on one of the damned souls tumbling toward hell, a face that bears unmistakable resemblance to Biagio da Cesena, the master of ceremonies who dared criticize the nudity that fills this sacred space. Revenge, Michelangelo understands, can be eternal when carved in stone or sealed in fresco. Above his head, the chapel's vault already displays the creation narrative that has consumed 4 years of his life. But hidden within those biblical scenes lie anatomical studies that reveal knowledge no artist should possess. The Florentine has dissected corpses in secret, mapping muscles and organs with precision that enables him to paint human forms with accuracy that astounds contemporaries. Each figure becomes a textbook of forbidden learning, its beauty concealing truths that could lead to charges of necromancy or worse. The brain that Michelangelo paints in the separation of light from darkness mirrors exactly the dissections he performed on cadavers stolen from Santa Maria del Santo Spirito. This hidden knowledge, embedded in imagery that appears purely devotional, represents the kind of dangerous synthesis that characterizes Renaissance culture, the merger of sacred and profane wisdom that creates beauty while challenging every assumption about the boundaries between acceptable and forbidden learning. Pope Julius II della Rovere, who commissioned this masterpiece, remains unaware of the anatomical secrets that surround him during private prayers in his chapel. The warrior pontiff focuses on military campaigns that will restore territorial integrity, while his artist embeds subversive knowledge in the very walls that witness his devotions. This blindness to hidden meanings becomes typical of an age when power and knowledge exist in complex relationships that neither party fully comprehends. The establishment of the formal library under Nicholas V in 1475 transforms Rome into a magnetic pole that attracts manuscripts from across the known world. The humanist pope understands that cultural authority depends on superior access to texts, leading him to dispatch agents throughout Europe and the Near East, with instructions to acquire any work that might enhance the collection's prestige. Their success creates repositories that rival Alexandria at its height, while serving contemporary political purposes that the ancients never imagined. Greek scholars fleeing the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 arrive in Rome carrying manuscripts that preserve classical learning thought lost forever. These refugees find welcome in chambers beneath the apostolic palace, where their expertise in ancient languages enables the translation of texts that reveal how extensively Christian doctrine draws from pagan philosophy. Marsilio Ficino and his colleagues work tirelessly to reconcile Platonic wisdom with biblical truth, creating synthetic theologies that enrich Renaissance spirituality while generating suspicions among traditionalists who prefer their faith uncontaminated by foreign influences. When Pope Paul VI Borghese split the secret archives from the library in 1612, he introduced distinctions that allowed for smarter, more organized control of records. Diplomatic correspondence, legal proceedings, and administrative records that could embarrass the church find secure storage in chambers, where access requires special authorization that even scholars with library privileges cannot obtain. This separation enables the appearance of scholarly openness, while maintaining absolute control over materials that document the gap between public teaching and private policy. Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, who will become Paul III, epitomizes the Renaissance prelate whose appreciation for classical learning coexists with ruthless pursuit of family advancement. His court attracts humanist scholars whose Greek and Latin expertise enables access to ancient texts, while their discretion ensures that dangerous discoveries remain confined to appropriate circles. The cardinal's patronage creates networks of intellectual dependency that serve both scholarly and political purposes, demonstrating how cultural authority reinforces temporal power. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum emerges from the Council of Trent as the Church's systematic response to the printing revolution that threatens to democratize access to dangerous ideas. The first edition, published in 1559 under Paul IV Carafa, lists specific titles and authors whose works pose threats to orthodox belief or moral behavior. This innovation moves beyond medieval approaches that relied on local censorship to create universal standards that can guide authorities throughout the Catholic world. Galileo Galilei's trial in 1633 reveals how sophisticated the Church's methods for controlling scientific discourse have become since medieval times. Rather than simply condemning heliocentrism as heretical, the Inquisition focuses on the physicists' disobedience to explicit instructions, not to teach Copernican theory as established fact. This approach enables authorities to maintain that their condemnation addresses disciplinary rather than doctrinal issues, preserving flexibility for future policy adjustments when scientific evidence becomes overwhelming. The complete transcripts of Galileo's proceedings, released only in 1992, document the careful choreography that shapes the trial's outcome. Inquisitors allow the defendant to present his arguments while ensuring that their questions expose the weakness of his position according to Aristotelian standards that still govern natural philosophy. The scientist's forced recantation provides the public spectacle that demonstrates ecclesiastical authority, while private correspondence reveals officials' awareness that their position may prove untenable as astronomy advances. Cardinal Robert Bellamine's earlier warning to Galileo in 1616 demonstrates the sophisticated approach that characterizes mature counter-Reformation policy toward intellectual dissent. Rather than condemning the scientist outright, the cardinal advises him to present heliocentric theory as mathematical hypothesis rather than physical reality. This distinction enables continued astronomical research while preventing direct challenges to scriptural authority, creating space for scientific progress within theological constraints. The fate of Giordano Bruno illustrates what happens when intellectual independence refuses to accept such compromises. The Dominican philosopher's execution in 1600 sends unmistakable messages about the consequences of persisting in positions that challenge fundamental teachings about the nature of reality. Bruno's willingness to die, rather than recant his beliefs about infinite worlds and the plurality of inhabited planets, makes him a martyr to free thought, while demonstrating the limits of tolerance for ideas that threaten cosmic hierarchies supporting terrestrial authority. Pope Alexander VI, Borgia, represents the scandal and splendor that characterized the Renaissance papacy at its most extreme. Rodrigo Borgia's election through bribery that shocks even contemporary observers demonstrates how thoroughly worldly considerations have penetrated the College of Cardinals. His reign features murders, incest, and nepotism that create legends, while his bull Inter Caetra divides the New World between Spain and Portugal, with strokes of the pen that reshape global politics. The papal apartments that Alexander VI commissions from Pinturicchio reveal how seamlessly pagan and Christian imagery merge in Renaissance art. Frescoes that celebrate the resurrection share wall space, with scenes depicting Egyptian gods and classical mythology, creating visual programs that would horrify medieval theologians. These decorations reflect the syncretic spirituality that characterizes humanist culture while demonstrating how completely the papacy has embraced worldly magnificence as appropriate expression of divine authority. Cesare Borgia's military campaigns in central Italy serve his father's goal of creating a hereditary papal state that can compete with other European monarchies. The methods employed in these conquests, assassinations, betrayals, strategic marriages, and tactical alliances, become study material for Niccolò Machiavelli, whose analysis of effective statecraft draws heavily on Borgia examples. The prince's success in conquering the Romagna demonstrates how spiritual authority can employ temporal methods without apparent contradiction. Lucrezia Borgia's marriages function as diplomatic instruments that advance family interests while generating scandals that inspire centuries of speculation. Her successive unions with Giovanni Sforza, Alfonso of Aragon, and Alfonso d'Este create alliances that strengthen papal position in Italian politics, while rumors about her relationships with father and brother become focal points for enemies seeking to discredit the dynasty. The truth about these allegations remains buried in archives that guard family secrets as carefully as matters of state. Finding the New World raises tough questions for church leaders, who must figure out how these new peoples fit into a worldview that only accounted for Europe, Asia, and Africa. Spanish conquistadors encounter civilizations whose sophisticated achievements challenge European assumptions about cultural hierarchy, while their religious practices present theological problems that require careful analysis. Dominican and Franciscan missionaries who accompany expeditions send reports that document both the destruction of native cultures and efforts to preserve elements that might serve conversion purposes. Bartolomé de las Casas's brief account of the destruction of the Indies provides detailed documentation of Spanish atrocities that contradict official claims about the benevolent character of colonial expansion. The Dominican friars' eyewitness accounts of mass murder, enslavement, and systematic brutality create evidence that embarrasses authorities who prefer to emphasize missionary successes rather than colonial failures. His work finds limited circulation during his lifetime, but survives in manuscript form that preserves testimonies for future investigators. Pope Paul III's bull, Sublimis Deus, in 1537, declares that indigenous Americans possess rational souls and cannot be enslaved. But this humanitarian gesture fails to address the economic realities that drive colonial exploitation. Spanish authorities ignore or circumvent the papal prohibition through legal fictions that maintain forced labor systems under different names. The gap between official policy and colonial practice creates documentation that reveals how thoroughly economic interests override moral considerations in imperial administration. The Council of Trent, convened in response to Protestant challenges, produces decrees that systematize Catholic doctrine while creating new mechanisms for controlling intellectual dissent. The Council's sessions, extending intermittently from 1545 to 1563, address questions ranging from scriptural authority to clerical celibacy. But their most significant innovation lies in establishing permanent institutions for monitoring orthodoxy throughout the Catholic world. The Roman Inquisition, reorganized under Paul III in 1542, receives enhanced powers that enable systematic surveillance of suspect individuals and dangerous ideas. Reginald Pole's near election as Pope in 1549 demonstrates how close the Church comes to choosing a leader whose reformist agenda might have prevented the Counter-Reformation's authoritarian character. The English cardinal's defeat by a single vote enables the election of Julius III del Monte, whose policies emphasize institutional control over pastoral renewal. Documents that record the conclave's deliberations reveal the political calculations that shape this crucial decision, though their contents remain sealed to protect the mythology of divine guidance in papal selection. The Jesuits, founded by Ignatius Loyola in 1540, become the Church's most effective weapon against Protestant expansion through educational programs that combine intellectual excellence with absolute loyalty to Rome. Their schools attract students from across Europe, while their missionaries penetrate territories where traditional religious orders cannot operate effectively. The spiritual exercises that guide Jesuit formation create psychological techniques that ensure conformity while maintaining appearances of intellectual freedom. Francisco Suarez's political theories demonstrate how Jesuit thinkers adapt medieval concepts of papal supremacy to address early modern questions about sovereignty and resistance to tyranny. His arguments that political authority derives from popular consent while remaining subject to spiritual oversight provide theoretical foundations for opposition to Protestant rulers who challenge ecclesiastical privileges. These doctrines influence political developments throughout Europe, while creating intellectual frameworks that support both democracy and theocracy, depending on circumstances. Under Jesuit leadership, the Roman College becomes a powerhouse of scientific education, promoting the Church's mission while fueling intellectual progress. Christopher Clavius and his colleagues worked to perfect the Gregorian calendar, while training mathematicians and astronomers whose expertise serves both scholarly and pastoral purposes. Their research demonstrates how the Church can patronize scientific investigation without abandoning claims to authority over natural philosophy. Caravaggio's revolutionary painting style emerges from the same cultural matrix that produces Galileo's telescopic observations and Bruno's cosmological speculations. The artist's use of dramatic lighting and realistic human models scandalizes traditionalists who prefer idealized religious imagery, but his techniques create emotional impact that serves devotional purposes more effectively than conventional approaches. His personal life, marked by violence, homosexual relationships, and criminal behavior, provides ammunition for enemies, while his artistic genius ensures continued patronage from sophisticated collectors. The painter's depiction of religious scenes using Roman street people as models challenges assumptions about the appropriate representation of sacred subjects, while creating art that speaks to popular audiences in ways that traditional iconography cannot match. His Death of the Virgin uses a drowned prostitute as the model for Mary, creating scandal while producing imagery that communicates the reality of death with unprecedented power. These innovations demonstrate how artistic genius can transform dangerous material into acceptable forms that serve orthodoxy while challenging its comfortable assumptions. Annibale Carracci's decorative program in the Palazzo Farnese demonstrates the sophisticated synthesis of Christian and pagan themes that characterizes mature Renaissance culture. His frescoes celebrating divine love draw equally on biblical and classical sources, while creating visual narratives that educate viewers in both sacred and secular wisdom. The project's success establishes precedents for ecclesiastical patronage that encourages artistic innovation within theological boundaries. The University of Rome's curriculum reveals how successfully the Church has adapted humanist educational methods to serve orthodox purposes. Students who master Greek and Latin gain access to patristic sources, while their training in rhetoric and dialectic prepares them for careers that advance institutional interests. The integration of classical learning with theological instruction creates educated clergy who can engage Protestant scholars on equal terms while maintaining absolute loyalty to Roman authority. Cardinal Baronius's Ecclesiastical Annals provides the most sophisticated response to Protestant historiography produced during the Counter-Reformation period. His massive work, spanning 12 volumes, uses primary sources to demonstrate the antiquity and continuity of Catholic practices that reformers claim represent medieval innovations. The Cardinal's scholarship establishes new standards for historical research, while serving apologetic purposes that advance institutional interests. As the Renaissance reaches its conclusion, the foundations are complete for the global expansion that will carry European culture and Christian faith to every inhabited continent. The synthesis of classical learning and biblical wisdom that characterizes this period creates intellectual frameworks that enable adaptation to diverse cultural contexts while maintaining essential orthodoxy. The administrative innovations developed for controlling information provide models for governing territories whose populations speak different languages and follow different customs. Seeds planted in Renaissance workshops and libraries await seasons when they will bloom into the worldwide empire that will make Rome the center of the first global civilization. The artistic techniques perfected during this period become vehicles for communicating Christian truth to peoples who lack written languages, while the scholarly methods developed for preserving ancient wisdom enable the documentation of new discoveries that expand human knowledge beyond classical boundaries. Efforts to merge ancient learning with Christian faith eventually give rise to powers that reshape how Europe engages with the rest of humanity. The next chapter finds these Renaissance foundations supporting expansion that will test the Church's ability to maintain unity among believers whose cultural differences challenge every assumption about the universal character of Christian truth. Swiss guards ignite documents in marble fireplaces throughout the Apostolic Palace as Allied bombers drone overhead in the summer of 1944. The flames consume correspondence that could destroy reputations, financial records that reveal compromising transactions, and diplomatic cables that document relationships no government should acknowledge. Captain Hans Müller watches decades of carefully maintained secrets transform into ash, while Rome trembles under the weight of approaching liberation that threatens to expose every carefully guarded alliance forged during the war's darkest hours. The captain's orders come directly from Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, who served as papal nuncio to Germany before his election as Pope Pius XII 5 years earlier. The future pontiff's intimate knowledge of German politics, gained through years of diplomatic service in Munich and Berlin, enables him to understand exactly which documents must disappear before enemy forces arrive with their investigators and their uncomfortable questions about neutrality that never quite achieved true impartiality. Among the papers feeding these fires lie records of the Reichskonkordat negotiations that brought the Holy See into formal agreement with Adolf Hitler's regime in July 1933. The treaty's public provisions guarantee religious freedom for German Catholics, while its secret protocols enable state oversight of episcopal appointments and clerical education. Cardinal Pacelli's signature on this agreement represents the diplomatic triumph that establishes his reputation as a statesman, though the full implications of these arrangements will not become apparent until German armies begin their march across Europe. Franz von Papen's role in facilitating these negotiations demonstrates how secular politicians exploit religious concerns to advance authoritarian agendas. The German vice-chancellor understands that Catholic support provides essential legitimacy for the new regime, while ecclesiastical endorsement neutralizes potential opposition from the Church's extensive social networks. His success in securing papal cooperation marks the first major diplomatic victory for a government that few observers expect to survive its first year in power. The Concordat's Article 16 requires bishops to swear loyalty oaths to the German state that create unprecedented entanglements between spiritual and temporal authority. I swear and promise to honor the German Reich and the regional government, the prescribed formula declares, binding prelates to regimes whose policies may conflict with moral teaching. This innovation establishes templates for church-state relationships that enable authoritarian control while maintaining appearances of religious independence. Vatican financial records from the 1930s document gold transfers that flow through Swiss banks toward accounts controlled by officials whose war crimes will shock the civilized world. The Institute for the Works of Religion, established in 1942 under Pope Pius XII, processes transactions that enable the movement of Nazi assets through channels that exploit diplomatic immunity and banking secrecy laws. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, who later directs these operations, allegedly remarks that "you can't run the church on Hail Marys," though this quote may represent hostile interpretation of more nuanced observations about institutional realities. The wartime silence that characterizes the Holy See's response to reports of genocide reflects calculations that balance moral obligations against institutional survival. Intelligence reports reaching the Secretariat of State document mass killings with precision that leaves no doubt about their scope and systematic character. Yet official protests remain carefully worded to avoid direct confrontation with German authorities, who control access to Catholic populations throughout occupied Europe. This policy of diplomatic discretion enables continued pastoral activity while creating moral dilemmas that will haunt the Church for decades. Bishop Alois Hudal's residence in Rome becomes a headquarters for organizing escape routes that carry war criminals towards sanctuary in South America. The Austrian prelate's connections with German nationalist organizations position him perfectly to assist fugitives whose continued presence in Europe threatens both their own survival and the stability of governments seeking to build democratic societies on the ruins of fascist regimes. His activities, conducted with knowledge, if not explicit approval from higher authorities, establish the rat lines that enable hundreds of wanted men to evade justice. Klaus Barbie's escape through these networks demonstrates their efficiency in protecting individuals whose capture would create major embarrassments for institutions that prefer to emphasize their resistance to totalitarian ideology. The Butcher of Lyon receives false documentation that identifies him as a displaced person seeking refuge from communist persecution, enabling his passage through screening procedures designed to exclude war criminals. His successful escape to Bolivia represents the most notorious example of how these operations protect the guilty while claiming to assist the innocent. Operation Paperclip's recruitment of German scientists creates additional complications for authorities who must balance American intelligence interests against demands for justice from populations that suffered under Nazi occupation. Werner von Braun and his colleagues received sanctuary in the United States, despite their use of slave labor in rocket production, demonstrating how strategic considerations override moral objections when national security interests require technical expertise that only former enemies can provide. The Holy See's role in facilitating these arrangements remains carefully obscured through diplomatic channels that enable plausible deniability while providing essential services to allied intelligence agencies. Vatican officials who assist in screening procedures acquire detailed knowledge about the backgrounds of scientists and technicians whose skills advance American military capabilities, creating leverage that serves institutional interests in other negotiations with Washington policymakers. Angelo Roncalli's service as papal nuncio to France positions him to observe Allied intelligence operations while maintaining relationships that will prove valuable when he becomes Pope John XXIII 2 decades later. His diplomatic cables document the complex calculations that shape post-war reconstruction policies, while revealing the extensive coordination required to manage transitions from occupation to democratic governance. These experiences provide crucial preparation for leadership challenges that await the Church during the Cold War confrontation between communist and capitalist systems. Emanuela Orlandi's disappearance in June 1983 becomes the most lasting enigma tied to modern institutional secrecy. The 15-year-old daughter of a clerk vanishes while walking home from music lessons, triggering investigations that reveal connections between organized crime, intelligence agencies, and financial networks operating within the world's smallest sovereign state. Her fate remains unknown, despite decades of speculation that links her case to assassination attempts against Pope John Paul II, banking scandals involving the Institute for Religious Works, and Turkish terrorist operations targeting Western institutions. The Mehmet Ali Archer shooting of John Paul II in May 1981 demonstrates how easily determined assassins can penetrate security arrangements that appear impregnable to casual observers. The Turkish gunman's motives remain unclear despite extensive interrogation that fails to establish definitive connections to either Soviet intelligence or right-wing terrorist organizations seeking to destabilize Western governments. His later claims about third secrets of Fatima and apocalyptic visions suggest psychological instability that complicates efforts to determine whether his actions represent individual fanaticism or coordinated conspiracy. Investigations into the assassination attempt reveals surveillance capabilities that enable authorities to track suspects across international boundaries, while maintaining the fiction that diplomatic institutions operate above the mundane concerns of criminal justice. Intelligence agencies from multiple countries coordinate their responses to this unprecedented attack on religious leadership, while competing for access to information that might illuminate terrorist networks threatening their own national interests. The Banco Ambrosiano collapse in 1982 exposes financial relationships that connect the Institute for Religious Works to Italian organized crime through transactions that exploit banking secrecy laws and jurisdictional complexities. Roberto Calvi's role as chairman of Italy's largest private bank enables him to channel funds through offshore subsidiaries that obscure their ultimate destinations while generating enormous profits for investors who understand the system's vulnerabilities. Calvi's murder in June 1982 eliminates the individual most capable of explaining these complex arrangements to investigators, whose inquiries threaten to expose the full extent of criminal penetration into legitimate financial institutions. The banker's body, discovered hanging beneath London's Blackfriars Bridge, with bricks stuffed in his pockets, sends unmistakable messages to potential witnesses about the consequences of cooperation with law enforcement agencies. His death transforms a financial scandal into a murder investigation that reaches into the highest levels of European society. Under Licio Gelli's leadership, the P2 Masonic Lodge became the network that linked corrupt officials, criminal groups, and intelligence agents, all working toward hidden goals that demanded total secrecy. Membership lists discovered during police raids reveal connections that span the Italian establishment, while extending into neighboring countries where similar networks operate under different names. These revelations demonstrate how secret societies can penetrate democratic institutions while maintaining their clandestine character through careful recruitment and disciplined operational security. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger's role as prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith positions him to oversee investigations into doctrinal deviations while managing information that could damage institutional credibility if disclosed prematurely. His background as a theology professor provides the intellectual framework needed to distinguish between legitimate theological inquiry and dangerous challenges to essential teachings, enabling precise responses that maintain orthodoxy without stifling scholarly investigation. The liberation theology movement in Latin America creates challenges that require sophisticated responses, balancing social justice concerns against revolutionary ideologies that threaten established order throughout the Western Hemisphere. Cardinal Ratzinger's Instruction on Certain Aspects of the Theology of Liberation, issued in 1984, demonstrates how authorities can acknowledge legitimate grievances while rejecting Marxist analytical frameworks that transform religious institutions into instruments of political revolution. Gustavo Gutierrez's pioneering work in developing liberation theology demonstrates how sincere pastoral concerns can evolve into systematic challenges to traditional approaches to social questions. His emphasis on preferential options for the poor resonates with biblical teachings, while his analytical methods draw heavily on Marxist critiques of capitalist exploitation. This synthesis creates theological frameworks that inspire political activism, while generating suspicions among authorities who fear that social reform movements may evolve into revolutionary organizations. The Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua tests institutional responses to liberation theology when priests take direct roles in Marxist governments that challenge American interests throughout Central America. Cardinal Miguel Obando y Bravo's opposition to the revolutionary regime demonstrates how religious authorities can resist political co-optation while maintaining credibility with populations that support social transformation. His leadership provides alternative models for addressing inequality without embracing ideologies that threaten religious freedom. John Paul II's visits to Poland demonstrate how religious authority can inspire peaceful resistance to communist regimes, while avoiding direct confrontation that might provoke violent crackdowns. The Polish pontiff's ability to draw massive crowds for religious ceremonies creates opportunities for political expression that totalitarian systems cannot suppress without undermining their claims to popular legitimacy. His speeches carefully balance spiritual themes with subtle encouragement for democratic aspirations that eventually overwhelm authoritarian resistance. Born from the momentum of papal visits, The Solidarity movement owes much to the experience Catholic activists gained during decades of quiet, hidden work in communist times. Lech Wałęsa and his colleagues understand how to maintain discipline within clandestine networks while building popular support for demands that challenge fundamental assumptions about party control over social and economic life. Their success provides templates for democratic transitions throughout Eastern Europe. Vatican Ostpolitik during the 1960s and 1970s demonstrates sophisticated diplomatic approaches to managing relationships with communist governments that officially espouse atheistic ideologies while governing populations that include significant Catholic minorities. Cardinal Agostino Casaroli's negotiations with Eastern European officials create frameworks for limited religious freedom that enable pastoral care while avoiding direct challenges to political systems that view organized religion as inherently subversive. These diplomatic initiatives require careful balance between accommodation and resistance that enables the Church to maintain institutional presence in hostile environments, while preserving essential teachings that conflict with Marxist ideology. The agreements reached with various communist governments provide legal protections for religious activity, while accepting restrictions that limit evangelization and youth education. This policy of strategic compromise enables survival while creating opportunities for eventual expansion when political circumstances change. The Second Vatican Council's document, Dignitatis Humanae, revolutionizes traditional teaching about religious liberty by acknowledging the right of individuals to follow their consciences in matters of faith while maintaining claims about Catholic truth that justify continued missionary activity. This theological innovation enables improved relationships with democratic governments, while providing intellectual foundations for resistance to totalitarian systems that deny basic human rights. With Nostra Aetate, the Council reshapes ties with non-Christian religions, recognizing real spiritual wisdom in other faiths, while upholding Christianity's unique claim to saving truth. These developments enable interfaith dialogue that serves diplomatic purposes, while creating theological problems that require careful management to avoid relativistic implications that might undermine evangelization efforts. Intelligence cooperation between agencies and foreign governments creates networks that enable information sharing about terrorist threats while maintaining operational security that protects sources and methods from hostile penetration. The Holy See's unique position as a spiritual authority with global reach provides opportunities for gathering intelligence that secular agencies cannot access through conventional diplomatic channels. Nuncios often serve as quiet observers of political shifts in the countries where they're posted, showing how religious diplomacy can offer valuable insight without stirring diplomatic trouble. These operations require sophisticated understanding of the boundaries between legitimate pastoral concern and espionage activities that could compromise religious missions if exposed. Swiss Guard recruitment and training procedures ensure absolute loyalty to the institution while providing security capabilities that protect against threats ranging from individual terrorists to coordinated intelligence operations. The Guard's medieval uniforms and ceremonial weapons conceal professional military training that enables response to modern security challenges while maintaining traditional appearances that support institutional mystique. The Guard's oath of secrecy extends beyond protection of physical security to encompass any information they might acquire through their duties, creating additional layers of protection for sensitive activities that require absolute discretion. Their selection criteria emphasize psychological stability and religious commitment alongside military competence, ensuring that personal loyalties reinforce professional obligations to maintain institutional confidentiality. As the 20th century draws toward its close, the foundations are complete for the global challenges that will test institutional adaptability during the digital age. The diplomatic skills developed through centuries of political maneuvering provide tools for navigating relationships with democratic governments, while the intelligence capabilities acquired during the Cold War enable responses to terrorist threats that transcend national boundaries. Seeds planted in wartime Rome and nurtured through decades of ideological confrontation await seasons when they will bloom into the sophisticated information management systems that enable global religious authority to maintain relevance in an interconnected world. The techniques of secrecy and disclosure perfected during this period become essential tools for addressing scandals that threaten institutional credibility while pursuing spiritual missions that require temporal effectiveness. Defensive steps taken under totalitarian threat eventually evolved into subtle tools of influence, letting religious institutions guide political outcomes while seeming to stay neutral. The next chapter finds these foundations supporting efforts to address moral crises that test every assumption about the relationship between divine authority and human accountability in democratic societies that demand transparency from all institutions claiming moral leadership. Sister Lucia dos Santos sits at a wooden desk in her convent cell, her trembling hand guiding a fountain pen across paper that bears the papal seal. The 83-year-old Carmelite nun pauses, staring at words that describe visions no human should witness: cities reduced to ash, rivers running red with blood, a figure in white falling beneath a hail of bullets. The third secret of Fatima, which she first received as a 10-year-old shepherdess in 1917, has haunted her dreams for 7 decades, while popes and cardinals begged her to reveal what the Virgin Mary whispered during those blazing Portuguese afternoons. Outside her window, the winds of 1944 carry rumors of war's approaching end, but Lucia knows that greater trials await humanity. The Mother of God had shown her glimpses of atomic fire consuming nations, of persecution that would test every faithful soul, of a pope who would suffer martyrdom for his flock. These secrets burn within her heart like live coals, their weight growing heavier with each passing year as she watches world events unfold exactly as the celestial visitor had foretold. Once sealed, the envelope disappears into the papal archives, its contents hidden for 56 years, and known only to a handful who protect it like a state secret. Her handwritten Portuguese text describes events so terrifying that 3 consecutive pontiffs will refuse to publish its contents, choosing instead to maintain the mystery that surrounds Fatima's final prophecy. The apparitions themselves began on May 13th, 1917, when 3 shepherd children encountered a figure of indescribable beauty standing above a small oak tree in the Cova da Iria. Francisco Marto, Jacinta Marto, and Lucia claimed that this radiant woman identified herself as coming from heaven and requested their presence on the 13th day of each month until October. Word of these supernatural visits spread throughout Portugal, despite efforts by local authorities to suppress what they viewed as dangerous religious fanaticism. On June 13th, the second apparition revealed messages that would shift how divine involvement in history was understood. The mysterious figure revealed that a great war would end soon, but warned of a worse conflict to come if humanity failed to cease offending God. She spoke of Russia spreading its errors throughout the world, of nations being annihilated, of the Holy Father suffering greatly. These predictions seemed impossible to comprehend in 1917, when the Russian Empire still stood and world war appeared to be humanity's ultimate catastrophe. October 13th, 1917, witnessed the miracle of the sun, when 70,000 witnesses gathered in the Cova da Iria observed celestial phenomena that defied scientific explanation. Avelino de Almeida, a skeptical journalist from the anti-clerical newspaper O Século, described how the sun appeared to dance in the sky, hurling itself toward Earth before resuming its normal position. Rain-soaked spectators found their clothes completely dry, while others reported seeing colors cascade across the heavens like aurora borealis in broad daylight. Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli's investigation of these events, conducted while serving as papal nuncio to Portugal, shapes his approach to supernatural claims throughout his career. The future Pius XII interviews witnesses, examines medical records of miraculous healings, and studies meteorological data that might explain the solar phenomenon. His conclusion that these apparitions deserve recognition influences the Church's eventual approval, while establishing protocols for evaluating similar claims in other locations. The first secret, revealed during the July 13th apparition, consisted of a terrifying vision of hell that traumatized the child seers with images of souls in torment. Lucia's later description speaks of a sea of fire in which demons and damned humans writhed in anguish, their screams of despair audible above the crackling flames. This vision motivated the children's intensive prayer and penance, while providing theological confirmation of doctrines that modernist trends increasingly question. The second secret contained the Virgin's specific request for devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the consecration of Russia to prevent the spread of atheistic communism. The prophecy warned that failure to heed these requests would result in Russia spreading its errors worldwide, persecuting the Church, and causing the Holy Father to suffer greatly. This message gained particular significance after the Bolshevik Revolution that occurred just months after the final Fatima apparition. Sister Lucia's 1941 memoir, written at the request of her bishop, revealed additional details about the apparitions that had not been publicly disclosed. Her account described how the Virgin Mary taught the three children a prayer asking for the salvation of sinners, and promised that Francisco and Jacinta would die young, while Lucia lived to spread devotion to the Immaculate Heart. These predictions proved accurate when both younger children died during the influenza pandemic of 1919 to 1920. Pope Pius XII's consecration of the world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary in 1942 represented an attempt to fulfill the Fatima requests during World War II's darkest hours. The pontiff's radio address on October 31st reached Catholic populations throughout occupied Europe, while invoking Mary's protection against the totalitarian forces that threatened Christian civilization. This public ceremony established precedents for Marian devotion that would influence papal policy for decades. The third secret's concealment after Sister Lucia committed it to writing in 1944 created decades of speculation about its contents. Vatican officials consistently stated that the secret contained nothing contradicting church teaching, while refusing to release its text, fueling theories that it predicted papal assassination, nuclear war, or apostasy within the hierarchy. This policy of deliberate ambiguity preserved the secret's mystique, while avoiding potential panic that full disclosure might generate. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger's access to the third secret during his tenure as prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith shaped his understanding of divine warnings about modern society's spiritual dangers. His 1996 interview with journalist Vittorio Messori hinted at the secret's apocalyptic character while maintaining official silence about specific details. These careful revelations increased public interest while preserving institutional control over sensitive information. The assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II on May 13th 1981, exactly 64 years after the first Fatima apparition, convinced many observers that the third secret had predicted this event. The pontiff's survival and subsequent devotion to Our Lady of Fatima seemed to confirm supernatural protection, while raising questions about whether the prophecy had been completely fulfilled. His decision to place the bullet that nearly killed him in the crown of the Fatima statue demonstrated his belief in miraculous intervention. When part of the third secret was released in June 2000, it unveiled Sister Lucia's vision of a white-robed bishop struck down by gunfire as he climbed a mountain littered with crosses and the dead. Cardinal Angelo Sodano's official interpretation identified this figure with John Paul II and declared the prophecy fulfilled through his survival of the assassination attempt. This explanation satisfied some critics, while leaving others convinced that crucial details remained concealed. Akita apparitions in Japan during the 1970s presented messages that seemed to amplify and extend the Fatima warnings for a new generation facing nuclear threats. Sister Agnes Katsuko Asasagawa received visions of the Virgin Mary that emphasized themes of prayer, penance, and divine chastisement, while describing catastrophes that would surpass even the horrors of previous centuries. The wooden statue that wept human tears and bled from its hands provided physical evidence that attracted international attention. Cardinal Ratzinger's investigation of the Akita phenomena during his tenure at the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith resulted in cautious approval that acknowledged supernatural character while avoiding specific endorsement of the apocalyptic messages. This careful approach balanced recognition of genuine mystical experiences against concerns that excessive focus on catastrophic prophecies might distract from the Church's primary mission of proclaiming the gospel. The Bishop of Niigata's approval of the Akita apparitions in 1984 established precedents for evaluating modern supernatural claims that emphasize pastoral benefits over sensational elements. Bishop John Shojiro Ito's decision rested on careful examination of Sister Agnes's character, theological orthodoxy of the messages, and documented miraculous phenomena that resisted natural explanation. This methodical approach became a model for investigating similar claims in other locations. Medjugorje apparitions that began in Yugoslavia in 1981 created the most controversial Marian phenomenon of the modern era, with 6 young visionaries claiming daily communications with the Virgin Mary that continue decades after their initial experiences. The messages emphasize prayer, fasting, conversion, and peace, while drawing millions of pilgrims to a region torn by ethnic violence. This extraordinary duration and popularity have generated intense debate about authenticity and appropriate ecclesiastical response. Cardinal Christoph Schönborn's involvement in Medjugorje investigations reflects the complexity of evaluating ongoing supernatural claims in an age of global communications and mass media. His theological expertise and pastoral sensitivity position him to distinguish between genuine mystical experiences and psychological phenomena that might appear similar to casual observers. The Cardinal's careful approach demonstrates how contemporary authorities balance scientific analysis with openness to authentic divine intervention. The Vatican's commission studying Medjugorje phenomena, established by Pope Benedict XVI in 2010, exemplifies modern methods for investigating supernatural claims that attract international attention. This body of experts examines theological content, psychological evaluations of the visionaries, documented healings, and social effects of the purported apparitions, while maintaining strict confidentiality about their deliberations. Their eventual conclusions will influence how the Church responds to similar claims in an increasingly connected world. Vassila Ryden's True Life in God Messages, received through Interior Locutions since 1985, present teachings that blend orthodox theology with ecumenical themes that challenge traditional approaches to Christian unity. Her writings emphasize divine mercy and church reunification, while containing prophecies about future trials that will purify Christianity through suffering. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith's cautious response demonstrates how authorities evaluate mystical claims that touch on sensitive theological issues. Father Stefano Gobbi's Marian movement of priests, inspired by interior locutions attributed to the Virgin Mary, attracted thousands of clergy who sought spiritual renewal through devotion to the Immaculate Heart. The messages received by this Italian priest emphasized themes of apostasy, purification, and triumph that resonated with conservative Catholics concerned about modernist trends within the Church. This movement's growth illustrated how private revelations can influence pastoral approaches, even without official approval. The phenomenon of weeping statues that emerged throughout the 1990s challenged scientific understanding while generating intense popular devotion among believers who interpreted these events as divine warnings about moral decline. Investigations conducted by church authorities typically focused on excluding natural causes before considering supernatural explanations. But the frequency of such reports strained institutional capacity for thorough evaluation. These incidents demonstrated how readily religious imagination responds to signs that seem to confirm prophetic warnings. Conchita Gonzalez's experiences at Garabandal, Spain, during the 1960s included prophecies of a great miracle that would convince skeptics and a warning about divine chastisement that would follow if humanity failed to respond appropriately. The visionary's claims about a future pope who would visit Russia and a period of persecution that would test the faithful generated intense interest among Catholics seeking confirmation of apocalyptic expectations. The Bishop of Santander's negative evaluation of these phenomena illustrated institutional reluctance to endorse sensational prophetic claims. The Secrets of La Salette, revealed to two shepherd children in France in 1846, contained warnings about clerical corruption and social upheaval that proved remarkably accurate in predicting subsequent historical developments. Melanie Calval's publication of her Secret in 1879 created controversy by describing apostasy among church leadership and catastrophic events that would precede the second coming of Christ. These revelations influenced Catholic apocalyptic thought while generating suspicion among authorities who preferred less inflammatory prophetic messages. Sister Faustina Kowalska's Divine Mercy revelations, received through visions of Jesus Christ in the 1930s, emphasized God's infinite compassion while warning about the consequences of rejecting divine grace. Her writings described specific prayers and devotional practices that would obtain mercy for sinners, while prophesying a period of darkness that would test human faith. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith's initial prohibition of these devotions, later reversed under John Paul II, demonstrated how theological evaluation of mystical claims can evolve as understanding develops. The role of private revelation in Catholic theology requires careful balance between openness to authentic supernatural communication and protection against delusion or deception that might mislead the faithful. The Church's position that private revelations cannot add new doctrines to the deposit of faith, while acknowledging their potential value for spiritual growth, creates frameworks for evaluation that emphasize conformity with existing teaching. This approach preserves institutional authority while recognizing that divine communication may continue beyond the apostolic age. Ecclesiastical protocols for investigating supernatural claims involve medical examinations, psychological evaluations, theological analysis, and pastoral assessment that require expertise from multiple disciplines. The process typically extends over many years, while maintaining strict confidentiality to protect both the alleged visionaries and the integrity of the investigation. These procedures reflect sophisticated understanding of how suggestion, group psychology, and cultural expectations can influence religious experiences. The Vatican's Normae de Modo, Procedendi, Indiuticandis, Praesumptis, Apparitionibus, RC Revelationibus, issued in 1978, standardized procedures for evaluating supernatural claims throughout the Catholic world. These guidelines established criteria for distinguishing authentic mystical experiences from psychological phenomena, while requiring bishops to consult with experts before reaching final determinations. The document's emphasis on prudence and thorough investigation demonstrates institutional learning from previous cases where hasty judgments created problems. As the 20th century draws toward its close, the accumulated weight of modern apparitions and prophecies creates challenges that test traditional approaches to supernatural phenomena. The global character of contemporary religious communications, facilitated by mass media and international travel, transcends local ecclesiastical jurisdiction while generating expectations for rapid Vatican response to developments that previous generations handled at diocesan levels. Questions still swirl around the third secret of Fatima, fueling suspicions that church leaders hold undisclosed insight into the future of the world. Whether the complete truth has been revealed or crucial details remain concealed, the careful management of these revelations demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how prophetic knowledge must be balanced against pastoral responsibility. The techniques developed for handling such sensitive information provide templates for addressing future supernatural claims that may reshape religious understanding in ways that current generations cannot anticipate. Seeds planted in Portuguese meadows and nurtured through decades of careful investigation await seasons when they will bloom into the global Marian devotion that characterizes contemporary Catholicism. The methods of disclosure and concealment perfected during this period become essential tools for managing supernatural claims that arise in every corner of the world, while maintaining institutional credibility in an age that demands evidence for extraordinary assertions. Deep beneath the apostolic palace, where electric bulbs struggle against shadows that have accumulated for centuries, Professor John Miller follows his Swiss Guard escort through corridors lined with filing cabinets that stretch toward vanishing points. The Harvard historian carries a single notebook and 2 pencils, the only writing implements permitted in these chambers, where 50 miles of shelving hold documents that could rewrite the history of Western civilization. His hands shake slightly as he realizes that somewhere in this labyrinth rest letters that emperors died trying to obtain, confessions that popes prayed would remain forever buried, and testimony that could topple governments whose foundations rest on carefully constructed lies. He stops at door 47, a plain steel barrier, though the markings on his keys suggest access to secrets nearly lost to time. Beyond this threshold lie materials so sensitive that their very existence remains classified, documents whose disclosure could shatter alliances that have endured for decades, or destroy reputations built over centuries. Miller's research proposal, submitted 18 months earlier, requested access to correspondence between Pope Pius XII and German bishops during World War II. But the files now wheeled before him contain materials whose scope exceeds his wildest expectations. The name itself, Archievum Secretum Vaticanum, has misled observers for 4 centuries, since Paul V the Borghese formally separated these holdings from the public library in 1612. Secretum means private rather than secret in ecclesiastical Latin, yet this linguistic distinction provides little comfort to historians who understand how completely these privacy protections have shielded uncomfortable truths from scholarly examination. The Holy See's careful parsing of terminology reflects sophisticated understanding of how language shapes perception, while preserving maximum flexibility for future policy adjustments. Cardinal Raffaele Farina's appointment as archivist in 2007 brought fresh perspectives to an institution whose traditions had remained essentially unchanged since the Counter-Reformation. The former prefect of the Apostolic Library understood that contemporary historians required access to primary sources, while recognizing that premature disclosure could damage relationships that serve the Church's global mission. His policies balanced scholarly demands against institutional needs while establishing precedents that will guide information management for decades to come. The physical reality defies imagination. 85 kilometers of shelving arranged in underground chambers that extend beneath some of Rome's most famous landmarks. Temperature and humidity controls maintain precise environmental conditions that preserve parchment and paper, while armed guards patrol corridors, where unauthorized presence constitutes a criminal offense punishable by immediate arrest. The Vatican gendarmerie maintains jurisdiction over these spaces, with authority that supersedes even diplomatic immunity for most visitors. Access procedures developed over centuries ensure that only scholars with impeccable credentials and appropriate institutional sponsorship can request materials, while additional restrictions limit research to documents older than 75 years, unless special dispensation acknowledges compelling historical significance. This system protects contemporary diplomatic relationships while enabling eventual scholarly evaluation of decisions whose immediate consequences have already shaped world events. The Galileo trial records, finally opened to researchers in the 1980s, revealed the sophisticated legal reasoning that guided Inquisition procedures during the Scientific Revolution. Cardinal Bellarmine's correspondence demonstrates how church intellectuals struggled to reconcile biblical cosmology with astronomical discoveries, while maintaining institutional credibility in an age when scientific knowledge advanced faster than theological adaptation. These documents expose the gap between private uncertainty and public confidence that characterized ecclesiastical responses to intellectual challenges. Marginal notes in Galileo's own hand, discovered on documents thought to contain only official transcripts, provide glimpses into the physicist's private thoughts during his trial. His sardonic comments about Aristotelian philosophy and bitter observations about clerical ignorance reveal personality traits that official biographies have obscured for centuries. These informal additions humanize a figure whose transformation into symbol of scientific martyrdom has obscured the complex individual who navigated between truth and survival with remarkable skill. Henry VIII's annulment petition, submitted to Pope Clement VII in 1529, survives in its original form, complete with the English monarch's personal annotations and seal impressions that authenticate royal authorship. The king's handwritten marginalia reveal his intimate knowledge of canon law, alongside his growing frustration with papal delays that threaten his dynasty's survival. These notations provide insights into Henry's psychological state during the crisis that ultimately severed England from Roman obedience, demonstrating how personal emotions shape decisions with global consequences. Catherine of Aragon's own submissions to the annulment proceedings, preserved alongside her husband's materials, present legal arguments of surprising sophistication that challenge assumptions about Tudor-era women's education and political awareness. The Queen's citations of patristic sources and canonical precedents demonstrate scholarly preparation that rivals any contemporary theologian's work. Her passionate defense of her marriage's validity provides emotional counterpoint to Henry's calculated political arguments. Correspondence between Pope Innocent IV and Mongol Khans in the 13th century documents one of history's most unlikely diplomatic exchanges, with papal letters reaching courts in Karakorum, while Mongol responses arrived in Rome, carried by envoys who had traveled across continents. These materials reveal mutual curiosity between civilizations that understood each other's power, without sharing cultural assumptions about governance, religion, or the nature of authority itself. The Pope's letter to Guyuk Khan, written in 1245, combines religious instruction with political calculation in proportions that reflect the complexity of medieval diplomacy. Innocent's attempt to convert the Mongol ruler to Christianity, while simultaneously seeking protection for Christian populations under Mongol rule, demonstrates how spiritual missions intertwined with practical necessities, in an age when religious and temporal authority remained inseparable. Inquisition torture manuals from the medieval period preserved detailed instructions for extracting confessions through psychological pressure and physical coercion, their clinical language contrasting sharply with the human suffering they describe. Bernard Guy's Practica Inquisitionis Heritis Pravitatis, written around 1320, provides step-by-step procedures for conducting interrogations that maintain appearances of due process while ensuring predetermined outcomes. These documents reveal how legal procedures can be manipulated to serve institutional interests while preserving facade of justice. The manual's psychological insights demonstrate sophisticated understanding of human nature that enabled inquisitors to exploit victims' fears, loyalties, and religious beliefs to obtain desired confessions. Techniques for identifying lies, breaking resistance, and maintaining interrogator credibility reflect empirical knowledge gained through centuries of experience in extracting truth from unwilling subjects. This expertise influenced legal procedures throughout Europe, while establishing precedents for judicial torture that persisted into the modern era. Jewish forced conversion records from Spain and Portugal document the systematic destruction of religious communities through legal mechanisms that provided appearance of voluntary compliance with Christian requirements. Detailed registries preserve names, dates, and circumstances of conversions that occurred under duress, creating databases that enabled authorities to monitor converso families for signs of crypto-Jewish behavior. These materials provide statistical evidence of persecution's scope, while preserving individual stories of survival and resistance. Genealogical charts that track converso bloodlines across generations reveal how thoroughly religious persecution could penetrate family structures and social relationships. Inquisition investigators compiled detailed family trees that identified potential targets for investigation, while creating networks of mutual suspicion that destroyed community cohesion. These documents demonstrate how bureaucratic efficiency could amplify prejudice into systematic oppression that affected entire populations. Nazi gold transfer documentation, partially released in the 1990s, exposes financial relationships that connected the Institute for the Works of Religion to networks that laundered assets stolen from Holocaust victims. Swiss bank records preserved in these files trace precious metal movements through accounts controlled by officials whose war crimes shocked the civilized world. The Vatican's role in facilitating these transactions remains subject to ongoing investigation by historians who seek to understand how religious institutions became entangled in criminal activities. Bank statements that detail specific transactions reveal the mundane, bureaucratic procedures that enabled extraordinary crimes, with routine deposit slips and transfer authorizations. documenting the movement of wealth that represented the life savings of murdered families. These materials humanize statistical accounts of genocide, while demonstrating how normal institutional procedures can serve criminal purposes when ethical oversight fails. Pope Honorius I's condemnation for heresy in 681 AD created documents that challenge fundamental assumptions about papal infallibility centuries before this doctrine received formal definition. The Third Council of Constantinople's anathematization of a reigning pontiff for supporting monothelite theology preserves testimony that complicates later claims about the impossibility of papal error in matters of faith and morals. These records remain carefully guarded because their implications extend far beyond historical curiosity into contemporary theological controversies. Concilia acts that record the specific charges against Honorius demonstrate how even ancient authorities distinguish between personal opinions and official teaching, creating precedents that influence modern debates about the scope and limits of papal authority. The theological sophistication evident in these documents reveals how thoroughly early church leaders understood the complexities that later generations would face when defining the relationship between individual fallibility and institutional infallibility. Vatican computer hacking in 2012 resulted in the theft of thousands of documents that exposed internal corruption and power struggles through leaked correspondence that reached journalists throughout Europe. The VatiLeaks scandal revealed how completely modern technology had penetrated even the most secretive institution in the world, while demonstrating the vulnerability of traditional security measures to digital espionage. Paolo Gabriele's arrest as papal butler highlighted the personal betrayals that enable information theft, while illustrating how institutional loyalty can conflict with moral conviction. The leaked documents themselves, published in books that became international bestsellers, contained evidence of financial mismanagement, personal vendettas, and policy disputes that contradicted official claims about harmonious governance. Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone's correspondence revealed bitter conflicts with other Vatican officials, while financial records exposed cost overruns and questionable expenditures that embarrassed an institution claiming moral authority over global economic justice. Mafia excommunication files document the Church's evolving response to organized crime that operates within traditionally Catholic societies, where religious and criminal cultures intersect in complex ways. Pope John Paul II's explicit condemnation of Cosa Nostra in 1993 marked a decisive break with previous policies that avoided direct confrontation with criminal organizations whose members maintained formal religious observance. These materials trace the development of theological positions that justify excluding practicing Catholics from sacramental life based on their criminal activities. Correspondence between bishops in Sicily and Vatican officials reveals the pastoral dilemmas created when parishioners' criminal activities become incompatible with Christian teaching, forcing clergy to choose between maintaining community relationships and upholding moral standards. These documents preserve debates about whether criminals can receive forgiveness through repentance without abandoning illegal activities, creating theological questions that challenge traditional approaches to sin and redemption. The Knights Templar absolution, contained in the Chinon parchment, discovered in 2001 after 7 centuries of concealment, reveals Pope Clement V's secret forgiveness of charges that publicly justified the order's destruction. This extraordinary document exposes the gap between official church positions and private papal decisions, while demonstrating how political pressures can force pontiffs to sacrifice justice for institutional survival. The parchment's preservation suggests that medieval authorities understood the importance of maintaining evidence that might eventually serve exculpatory purposes. Detailed testimony recorded during Templar interrogations reveals the sophisticated torture techniques that extracted confessions later used to justify the order's condemnation, while also preserving evidence that contradicts these forced admissions. The contrast between public charges and private absolution demonstrates how legal procedures can be manipulated to achieve predetermined outcomes, while maintaining appearances of due process that satisfy contemporary observers. In regions where the Church held temporal power, papal estate records from the medieval era show labor arrangements that closely resembled slavery. Detailed accounts of serf obligations, punishment procedures, and family separations reveal how thoroughly spiritual institutions could exploit temporal power to maintain economic advantages that contradicted evangelical teachings about justice and mercy. These materials challenge romanticized views of medieval Christianity while preserving evidence of systematic oppression. Financial ledgers that track income from these estates demonstrate how agricultural profits funded construction projects, military campaigns, and luxury consumption that enhanced institutional prestige while impoverishing rural populations whose labor created this wealth. The contrast between pastoral ideals and economic realities reveals tensions that characterized religious institutions throughout their history as major landowners and political powers. Native American genocide documentation from colonial territories preserves papal correspondence that demonstrates detailed knowledge of atrocities committed against indigenous populations in the name of Christian evangelization. Reports from missionaries describe mass killings, enslavement, and cultural destruction, while requesting guidance about appropriate responses to Spanish colonial policies. The Vatican's failure to intervene effectively in these situations creates moral responsibility that continues to influence contemporary relationships with indigenous communities. Letters from Bartolomé de las Casas and other Dominican missionaries provide eyewitness accounts of colonial brutality that reached the highest levels of church leadership, while papal responses reveal the institutional paralysis that prevented effective action. These documents preserve evidence of moral awareness alongside administrative impotence, demonstrating how religious institutions can understand injustice without possessing the will or capability to address it effectively. Recent openings of Pius XII files in 2019 provided historians with access to wartime correspondence that had remained classified for 70 years, revealing the complexity of papal decision-making during the Holocaust, while documenting both humanitarian efforts and diplomatic failures. The Pope's private papers show extensive knowledge of Nazi atrocities, alongside careful calculations about appropriate responses that balanced moral obligations against institutional survival. These materials complicate simplistic judgments about wartime papal silence, while preserving evidence for ongoing historical evaluation. Diplomatic cables between the Vatican and German bishops expose the tensions that developed between local pastoral concerns and global political considerations, as church leaders struggled to respond to unprecedented moral challenges. The correspondence reveals how completely Nazi policies had penetrated German Catholic life, while documenting both resistance and collaboration that characterized religious responses to totalitarian persecution. As the digital age transforms information management throughout the world, these ancient repositories face challenges that test traditional approaches to preserving sensitive knowledge while enabling appropriate scholarly access. The Vatican's gradual embrace of digital cataloging and controlled online access represents recognition that contemporary historians require technological tools that previous generations never imagined. Yet the fundamental tension between transparency and confidentiality remains as relevant today as it was during the Counter-Reformation. The future of these collections depends on balancing institutional needs for privacy against scholarly demands for access in an age when information wants to be free, while secrets retain their power to embarrass, enlighten, or endanger those whose actions shaped history's course. The methods developed for managing this tension will influence how religious institutions adapt to democratic societies that expect transparency from all organizations claiming moral authority over human behavior. What lies buried in these vaults continues to shape contemporary events through its very hiddenness, creating questions that fuel speculation while preserving mysteries that may contain truths too dangerous for immediate disclosure. The next chapter finds these foundations supporting efforts to address moral crises that test every assumption about the relationship between divine authority and human accountability in societies that demand answers to questions their ancestors never dared to ask. Pope Francis sits alone in his private study at Casa Santa Marta, the morning light casting long shadows across financial reports that tell stories no balance sheet should contain. Before him lie audit findings that trace money flows through accounts whose very existence contradicts every teaching about evangelical poverty, forensic analyses that connect respected institutions to criminal networks, and testimony from investigators whose discoveries have cost careers and, in some cases, lives. The Argentine pontiff's weathered hands turn pages that chronicle how thoroughly corruption has penetrated the structure he now leads, each revelation adding weight to decisions that will determine whether transparency becomes the Church's salvation or its destruction. Outside his window, Rome awakens to another day of scandals that no amount of prayer seems able to silence. Journalists gather at press conferences where spokesman Alessandro Gisotti deflects questions with practiced expertise, while Vatican prosecutors prepare cases that could implicate cardinals whose red hats once guaranteed immunity from earthly justice. The digital age has shattered walls that protected secrets for centuries, creating transparency that exposes both genuine reforms and persistent resistance to change. Cardinal George Pell's conviction for sexual abuse in Australia, later overturned by the High Court, demonstrated how completely the legal landscape has shifted since the days when ecclesiastical immunity protected church leaders from secular prosecution. The Australian cardinal's role as prefect of the Secretariat for the Economy had positioned him to implement financial reforms that threatened networks whose operations required opacity to survive. His legal troubles, regardless of their ultimate resolution, illustrated how personal scandals can derail institutional changes that challenge entrenched interests. The Vatican Bank's transformation under President Jean-Baptiste de François represents the most dramatic shift in papal financial management since the medieval period. The French businessman's background in international banking brought professional standards that exposed decades of irregularities while establishing compliance procedures that satisfy international regulators. His reforms closed thousands of suspicious accounts while implementing oversight mechanisms that monitor transactions for money laundering and terrorist financing. Moneyval's evaluation reports track the Holy See's progress toward meeting international standards for financial transparency, while documenting resistance from officials who prefer traditional methods of managing institutional wealth. The European anti-money laundering body's assessments provide objective measures of reform progress, while creating external pressure that reinforces papal demands for accountability. These evaluations transform internal church governance into international relations issues that affect diplomatic relationships with major powers. The Institute for the Works of Religion's annual reports, published since 2013, provide unprecedented visibility into financial operations that had remained opaque for centuries. Balance sheets that list assets, investment strategies, and charitable distributions create public accountability that that constrains management decisions while building credibility with external partners. This transparency revolution extends beyond mere disclosure to embrace governance principles that subordinate institutional interest to mission requirements. Cardinal Angelo Becciu's dismissal from the College of Cardinals in 2020 exposed investment scandals that reached the highest levels of church administration, while revealing how personal relationships could override fiduciary responsibilities. The Italian cardinal's involvement in London real estate purchases that cost the Holy See hundreds of millions of euros demonstrated how traditional approaches to financial management had become liabilities in an interconnected global economy. His fall from grace signaled papal determination to enforce accountability regardless of personal loyalties or hierarchical status. The Secretariat for the Economy's investigations into departmental spending uncovered patterns of financial irregularity that spanned decades while revealing cultural attitudes that treated institutional resources as personal assets. Auditors discovered credit card charges for luxury goods, unauthorized consulting payments to family members, and property deals that benefited individuals rather than institutional missions. These findings prompted reforms that centralized financial oversight, while establishing professional standards for expense approval and vendor selection. Opus Dei's influence within Vatican administration continues to generate speculation about secret networks that shape papal policy through informal channels that bypass traditional governance structures. The personal prelature's members occupy strategic positions throughout the Roman Curia, while maintaining loyalties that transcend departmental boundaries, creating coordination capabilities that can advance specific agendas without formal authorization. Critics argue that this institutional opacity contradicts transparency principles, while supporters emphasize the movement's contribution to spiritual renewal and administrative competence. The beatification of Josemaria Escrivá in 2002 attracted criticism from historians who questioned both the speed of the process and the suppression of testimony that challenged claims about the founder's sanctity. John Allen Jr.'s investigative reporting uncovered evidence that Opus Dei spent enormous sums to expedite canonization proceedings, while discouraging unfavorable witnesses from cooperating with investigators. These revelations illustrated how wealth and influence could shape even the most sacred church procedures. Theodore McCarrick's laicization in 2019 marked an unprecedented punishment for a cardinal whose sexual abuse and financial misconduct had been known to authorities for decades, before public exposure forced decisive action. The former Archbishop of Washington's relationships with wealthy donors who funded lavish lifestyle while overlooking moral failings demonstrated how money could purchase protection from accountability. His downfall coincided with papal efforts to establish zero-tolerance policies that previous administrations had implemented inconsistently. The McCarrick Report, released in 2020, provided detailed chronology of institutional failures that enabled predatory behavior while protecting institutional reputation over victim welfare. The document's frank acknowledgement of episcopal negligence and papal misjudgment marked a new standard for institutional transparency about past mistakes. This unprecedented candor reflected recognition that credibility required honest accounting of failures, rather than defensive denials that had characterized previous responses to abuse scandals. Vigano letters that accused Pope Francis of covering up McCarrick's crimes created internal crisis that pitted conservative and progressive factions against each other, while raising questions about the reliability of institutional communications. Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano's public accusations forced papal responses that balanced transparency demands against diplomatic necessities. demonstrating how digital communications had eliminated traditional buffers between internal disputes and public scrutiny. The controversy illustrated how social media could amplify institutional conflicts while bypassing normal channels for resolving disagreements. The Amazon Synod of 2019 generated fierce debates about clerical celibacy and female ordination that exposed theological divisions within the Church, while creating expectations for changes that conservative elements viewed as threats to fundamental teachings. Progressive participants interpreted synodal discussions as mandates for reforms that would adapt church practices to contemporary needs, while traditionalists emphasized continuity with historical precedents that had defined Catholic identity for centuries. Synodal working papers that proposed married priests and female deacons sparked resistance from African and Asian bishops, who argued that Western concerns should not determine global church policies. Cardinal Robert Sarah's opposition to these proposals reflected broader tensions between local adaptation and universal consistency that characterized contemporary Catholic governance. The Synod's final document balanced competing demands through compromise language that satisfied neither reformers nor traditionalists. Swiss Guard modernization efforts have adapted medieval traditions to contemporary security requirements while maintaining ceremonial functions that support institutional mystique. Colonel Christoph Graf's reforms introduced professional military training alongside traditional pageantry, creating capabilities that can address threats ranging from individual terrorists to coordinated intelligence operations. The Guard's updated equipment includes body armor and advanced communications, while their colorful uniforms continue to attract tourists and pilgrims who expect visual confirmation of papal grandeur. Recruitment standards now emphasize psychological stability and technological competence alongside religious commitment and physical fitness, reflecting recognition that modern security challenges require skills that previous generations never needed. Background investigations examine candidates' financial histories and personal relationships, while psychological evaluations identify potential vulnerabilities that hostile services might exploit. These procedures balance security requirements against privacy rights, while maintaining Swiss citizenship requirements that limit the applicant pool. Vatican observatory research continues under Jesuit direction that emphasizes scientific excellence while addressing theological questions about the relationship between faith and empirical knowledge. Director Guy Consolmagno's work in planetary astronomy demonstrates how religious institutions can contribute to scientific advancement while maintaining distinctive perspectives on cosmic significance. The observatory's international collaborations position church scientists as peers within global research communities, while providing platforms for addressing science-religion dialogue. Papal statements on climate change and economic inequality have positioned the Holy See as advocate for global governance solutions that transcend national boundaries while challenging political leaders who prioritize short-term interests over long-term sustainability. Laudato Si's environmental theology created frameworks for addressing ecological crisis through spiritual conversion that complements technical solutions with moral transformation. This approach enables religious authority to engage contemporary policy debates while maintaining distinctive contributions that secular institutions cannot provide. Pontifical Academy for Life investigations into genetic engineering and artificial intelligence address bioethical questions that will shape human development, while establishing moral frameworks that can guide technological advancement. Archbishop Vincenzo Paglia's leadership has expanded the Academy's focus beyond traditional life issues to encompass broader questions about human dignity in technological societies. These initiatives position the Church as participant in discussions about humanity's future, while asserting moral authority over scientific developments. Digital evangelization initiatives under the Pontifical Council for Social Communications attempt to harness internet technologies for spreading Christian messages while competing with secular content that dominates online attention. The Vatican's social media presence reaches millions of followers while creating new vulnerabilities to criticism and misinterpretation that traditional media channels had filtered. These efforts balance missionary imperatives against communication risks in environments that the Church cannot control. Pope Francis's appointment of female administrators to positions traditionally reserved for clergy signals gradual recognition that governance competence transcends ordination requirements while maintaining theological positions that exclude women from priestly ministry. Sister Raffaella Petrini's role as Secretary General of the Governorate represents the highest position ever held by a woman in Vatican administration, though her authority remains subordinate to male superiors who retain final decision-making power. The Commission for the Protection of Minors, established in 2014, attempts to create global standards for preventing sexual abuse, while addressing institutional cultures that had prioritized reputation protection over child welfare. Cardinal Sean O'Malley's leadership brought credibility earned through handling abuse crises in Boston, while Commission members' diverse backgrounds provided perspectives that challenged traditional approaches to scandal management. Their recommendations emphasized transparency and accountability as essential elements of effective prevention. Resistance to these reforms from curial officials who prefer traditional methods of handling sensitive issues illustrates the difficulty of changing institutional cultures that have developed over centuries. Anonymous letters and strategic leaks that undermine reform initiatives demonstrate how internal opposition can sabotage papal policies while maintaining plausible deniability about their sources. This resistance reflects broader tensions between pastoral renewal and administrative continuity that characterize contemporary Vatican governance. Financial reforms that centralize purchasing and contract approval have eliminated traditional practices that enabled department heads to operate independently, while creating oversight mechanisms that monitor expenditures for irregularities. Professional procurement procedures now require competitive bidding for major purchases, while establishing clear criteria for vendor selection that reduce opportunities for corruption. These changes have generated resistance from officials who viewed discretionary spending as perquisites of office. Real estate management that consolidates Vatican properties under professional oversight has ended practices that enabled personal use of institutional assets while generating revenue that supports charitable activities. Property audits discovered unauthorized occupancy arrangements alongside deferred maintenance that had reduced asset values while creating safety hazards. Professional management companies now handle rental negotiations and facility maintenance according to commercial standards that maximize returns on investment. The Vatican's COVID-19 response demonstrated both institutional vulnerability and adaptive capacity as pandemic restrictions challenged traditional practices while creating opportunities for innovation. Pope Francis's solitary Easter celebrations in empty St. Peter's Basilica provided powerful imagery of isolation that resonated with global audiences, while live-streamed liturgies reached larger audiences than physical gatherings had ever attracted. These experiences accelerated digital initiatives that will permanently alter how the Church communicates with worldwide constituencies. Vaccination campaigns that prioritized vulnerable populations while addressing conspiracy theories demonstrated how religious authority could support public health initiatives while combating misinformation that threatened community welfare. Papal endorsements of vaccine development and distribution countered skepticism from Catholics who viewed pandemic responses as threats to religious freedom, illustrating how institutional credibility could influence public opinion on contentious issues. As this epic narrative approaches its conclusion, the institution that began in Roman catacombs faces challenges that test every assumption about the relationship between divine authority and human accountability. The techniques of secrecy and disclosure that served papal interests for 2 millennia must adapt to democratic societies that demand transparency from all organizations claiming moral leadership over human behavior. Whether the Church emerges from these trials stronger or weaker depends on its ability to balance institutional survival against mission requirements in an age when information cannot be contained by traditional boundaries. The mysteries that remain buried in Vatican vaults continue to shape contemporary events through their very hiddenness, creating speculation that may prove more damaging than truth itself. Future generations will judge whether the gradual embrace of transparency represents genuine conversion or strategic adaptation to circumstances that permit no alternative. The seeds of renewal planted during this pontificate await seasons when they will either bloom into institutional transformation or wither under pressure from forces that prefer the comfortable darkness of traditional secrecy. Born in the shadow of Roman persecution, these structures now sway global affairs, yet they also carry risks, especially when values are compromised by self-interest. The final test of these ancient methods lies not in their effectiveness at preserving secrets, but in their ability to serve truth in an age when transparency has become both enemy and ally of institutions that claim to speak for the divine in human affairs.